Hi everyone, and welcome to Day 10 of History and Systems of Psychology. I'm excited to be with you today. I don't know if anyone's opened the exam and completed that yet, but as a reminder, that exam is currently open. You have until Sunday at 11:59 to take the exam. Any questions about that? No? Okay. Well, I'd like to go ahead and start with a video. The philosophers we're going to be talking about in this chapter and in the next chapter are philosophers who lived during the age of enlightenment. Does anyone know anything about this age? Nothing? So it came after the Dark Ages, enlightenment after being dark. That makes sense, right? Well, let's go ahead and watch this video, and then hopefully you will learn a few things. And I think it's important to talk about this history so that when we're talking about philosophers, we understand the context and time, or zeitgeist, as it were, in which they lived. So we will go ahead and start with this video. Please take notes. We'll be talking about it after you view it.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So far, we've seen a ton of political change and continuing warfare in the midst of the 17th century's Little Ice Age, and history often focuses on those types of political and military stories, but there were also other changes occurring, shifts in how people perceive the everyday world.
Is that loud enough? Would you like it louder?
Eclipses with human events goes back a very long way, like to the beginning of our species, as does the belief that supernatural forces are deeply shaping the lives of individual humans. For instance, in a previous video about witchcraft, we discussed how earthquake tremors in Istanbul in 1648 were seen as portents of a sultan's death a few months later. But a century after that, a huge earthquake struck Lisbon, Portugal on All Saints' Day of 1755, and tens of thousands of people died, many from a tsunami that followed the quake. Now, some theologians argued that this was punishment from God for the world's sins, but others pointed out that the earthquake had destroyed a lot of churches while sparing a lot of brothels. Voltaire wrote a famous poem in response to the earthquake that included the memorable lines, "As the dying voices call out, will you dare respond to this appalling spectacle of smoking ashes with, 'This is the necessary effect of the eternal laws freely chosen by God'?" The way Europeans were looking at the world had changed between the Istanbul earthquake and the Lisbon one. The Enlightenment was thriving. So today we want to emphasize that the Enlightenment is not all highfalutin calculations of the sun's orbit or theories about the mathematical laws of the universe, or for that matter, theories about earthquake causality. It also considered much more down-to-earth situations, like how people of different social classes should relate to one another, how trade and manufacturing should function, and what the relationship of ordinary people should be to their government. The Enlightenment, or Age of Light, refers to the belief that the musty old ideas needed to be exposed to the light of rational investigation to see if they were still valuable. The bright light of reason needed to shine on tradition. And this momentous challenge to tradition came about during a time in which Europe was being completely transformed in many ways that are sometimes forgotten amid all the excitement about Voltaire and reason. So let's go straight to the thought bubble today. Beyond the wars and state building we've already seen, increasing abundance and novelty was creeping into the everyday lives of Europeans. Coffee, tea, chocolate, tobacco, and other commodities led to experimentation. For instance, one English housewife saw tea for the first time and thought it was meant to be baked as a kind of pie filling. A diplomat said that tea and coffee had brought a greater sobriety and civility to everyday life in Europe. Europe had previously been a land of famine and mere subsistence for essentially all of its history, but now the cultivation of new foods from the Americas, like potatoes and corn, along with literally thousands of other new plants, meant that available calories were increasing, and it also introduced the idea that maybe the world didn't have to be perpetually on the brink of starvation and catastrophe. Also, by this time, tens of thousands of Europeans had traveled the world and had experienced other social orders firsthand. For instance, travelers discovered that people across Asia didn't seem as quarrelsome as Europeans. Drivers of carts didn't block narrow streets for hours arguing over who had the right of way. They politely agreed to let one or the other pass. They also saw that not all social orders were as hierarchical as most European ones, and that some societies even gave less weight to a person's parentage and more to a person's individual skills and talents. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So one of the first ways writers criticized outmoded ways of life was to make fun of them. Writers like Charles Louis de Secondant Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu, aka just Montesquieu. He really was the proper person to criticize outmoded ways of life, because boy did he have an outmoded name. Montesquieu was a jurist who owned an estate near Bordeaux, which by the way still makes wine under his name, and in 1721 he published the Persian Letters, in which Uzbek visitors find Europe amusing, if not shocking. The visitors, for instance, are amazed at the magic of priests who somehow perform the trick of turning wine into blood. And although they clearly see the problems in French society, they also firmly adhere to the mustiness of their old ways, such as keeping women secluded in a harem guarded by eunuchs. The message was that both Easterners and Europeans would burn. The author, Voltaire, who, slightly off topic, was quite handsome. I mean, very striking eyes. At any rate, he had similarly critical and amusing takes. His discourtesy to aristocrats eventually got him sent to the Bastille prison. In fact, in many rollicking tales, Voltaire made fun of overweening rulers and their endless corruptions. He valued honesty and those who lived simple lives, cultivating their gardens, as he famously put it in his satirical novel Candide, which you can learn more about in Crash Course Literature. Full of horrors and injustice, Candide appeared 4 years after the Lisbon earthquake, which Voltaire thought was firm evidence that we did not live in the best of all possible worlds. To replace the old stuffy ways of monarchs and priests and aristocrats telling us that we were already living in a perfect world, people needed to learn how to embrace the newly desirable traits of the Enlightenment, like being honest and inquisitive and open. The Swiss thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau had many ideas about education reform, for instance. He wasn't a wealthy or titled person, but rather was born into a watchmaking family and lived among artisans. His best-selling novel, Emile, describes a boy who grows up not in a city or a palace, but in a countryside where one can be oneself, a natural individual. Instead of experiencing common rote learning with large doses of religious and classical reading, Emile learns carpentry and gardening and other practical skills. In the countryside, he behaves in what Rousseau saw as the best possible way, naturally and without pretentious airs. Rousseau promoted what would come to be called middle-class values, like hard work, practicality, and domesticity for women. When Emile becomes a young man, the spouse chosen for him is plump and smiling and devoted to taking care of him, not studying or reading or practicing a craft or working hard to support the family like farm women did. Also, she will breastfeed their children, whereas both aristocratic women and busy working women at the time commonly used wet nurses. And as with Emile's upbringing, all of this is presented as natural. Meanwhile, wealthy women in Europe instituted the Enlightenment Salon, regular get-togethers in their homes to hear the latest idea, learn about the latest book, or meet the latest philosopher-influencer, called a philosophe in French. Slightly off topic, but I just love the idea of Rousseau and Voltaire as influencers. Like, I would have loved to see their Instagram feeds, Voltaire's smoldering selfies, Rousseau's weird rants written in the Notes app and then screenshotted. It would have been gold. At any rate, 18th century salon goers were often great readers and also experimenters with the latest commodities and fashion. Just like contemporary influencers, actually. And in terms of fashion, instead of looking to the courts for fashion inspiration, men like Voltaire now sported cottons from India, made into handkerchiefs that were worn around the neck, which would soon metamorphose into the necktie. They also sported banyans, that is, loose bathrobe-type garments that didn't need corsets, which men traditionally wore. As Rousseau believed, men should take off their makeup, wigs, and high heels and be natural, just like people did in other parts of the world. Just natural man as he is naturally made in the countryside, wearing a banyan and a feather hat. Transformation was in the air for everyone, not just the elites. Although imported foreign cottons were still illegal in France, for instance, many people now wore them, including servants who received cast-off cotton dresses or shirts that were bright and easy to keep clean. And to help people learn, there were many new texts, like in France, there was the Encyclopédie, you'll notice my amazing French pronunciation, which provided discussions of topics such as natural rights and the status of women. Its main editor, Denis Diderot, wrote, "All things must be examined, debated, investigated without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings." Diderot favored social and political reform, but the Encyclopédie, you know what, I'm just going to translate it, encyclopedia, also contained technical drawings of machinery, including machinery for mining, and that reflected practical values and also provided a spur to inventiveness and growing prosperity in Europe. Also, mining, which was already pretty important, is about to become extremely important thanks to coal. In general, Enlightenment aims were more worldly than spiritual. In Scotland, philosopher David Hume promoted reason above religion, concluding that belief in God was mere superstition. Some people, called theists, argued that God existed, but that he didn't have influence on everyday life after having set in motion the machinery of the universe. Many important founding fathers of the United States were deists, and if you believe, as many philosophers did, that God keeps a distance from human affairs, then the persecution of people for their religious beliefs starts to seem like cruel fanaticism. And some philosophers became activists, like Voltaire was outraged by the torture of Jean Calas, who was accused of murdering his son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. Calas's son had in fact committed suicide due to gambling debts. Calas was waterboarded and had every bone in his body broken before eventually dying under torture. Is there a bone back there? Alright, listen, this is a femur. I don't think it's an actual femur, I think it's like a recreate. Stan, is this a real femur? It is not a real femur. So I asked our brilliant writer Bonnie if Calas really had every bone in his body broken, and she responded, quote, "It's hard to know whether they got every one." And then she described Calas's torture to me with a level of detail that led me to conclude that, one, they probably did break every bone in his body, and two, oh my god, 18th century European torture was the worst. So last thing I'm going to say about this, if you invent a time machine, and I believe absolutely that you can, do not go back in time before, like, maybe 2003? Don't get me wrong, things are bad, but remember, they used to be so much worse. Speaking of terrible, let's talk about slavery. So Enlightenment views also fed into rising movements in Britain and France and the Netherlands and their colonies to abolish slavery. By this time, the slave trade was massive, and there was growing acknowledgement of its cruelty. In 1770, the French Catholic abbe, or clergyman, Guillaume Raynal, laid out the violent devastation of native peoples by invading Europeans, and in 1788, the freed slave Olaudah Equiano described the Middle Passage after he had been kidnapped in present-day Nigeria and enslaved. Now, Equiano is often believed to have been born in South Carolina, and his riveting memoir may have been cobbled together from the harrowing tales of others, but still, it was a bestseller, and it captured the inhumanity of white people toward black people and advocated enlightenment, freedom, and human rights for all. It also stirred freedmen and slaves alike to struggle for abolition. And there was also growing movements for other kinds of freedom. The Scotsman Adam Smith took on the mercantilist theory that global wealth was static and states could only increase their wealth by taking it from others, when he rejected ideas about stockpiling gold and refusing entry of goods into one's country, and also remaining a subsistence agricultural economy with serfs. He advocated instead for manufacturing and the division of labor and free trade. In a free or laissez-faire market, an individual would work and interact with others in the economy on the basis of their self-interest, and the sum of all self-interests would make for a balanced, harmonious, and prosperous society. Smith is best known today as the father of the free market, free trade, and individualism, thanks to his 1776 book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. But he also opposed absolutism and urged concern for the overall well-being of society, because in addition to the benefits of laissez-faire economies that he saw, Smith saw the potential harms, so he also argued for healing social policies. Another important Enlightenment book was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract, which famously begins, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." Rousseau picked up on John Locke's theme of the contract that individuals made with one another to form a state or a nation, and he believed that once freely formed, the state embodied the best that was in the collective community. Thus, individuals needed to give the state unconditional obedience because it represented the general will. Today, thinkers see that this call for obedience to the general will planted the seeds of dictatorial governments into the 20th century and beyond, but Rousseau did also emphasize individual sentiments as valuable. At the opposite end of Rousseau's general will was German philosopher Immanuel Kant's attention to individual reason. He famously exclaimed, "Dare to know," as he advanced the Enlightenment's commitment to the human mind and the ability of every person to think for themselves instead of simply obeying old commands and ideas. The human mind, he argued, housed categories of understanding with which information interacted to produce purely rational judgments. And in this way, we can trace our own culture's emphasis on individualism back to the Enlightenment. And many other individuals took refuge in Enlightenment thought, as well as taking it as a call to action. Upper-class Jewish women across Europe found the world of ideas so inspiring that they began salons too. In Berlin, for instance, they established 9 of the 14 salons in the city. And philosopher and author Moses Mendelssohn used the more tolerant atmosphere to express his optimism about the future of Jews in Europe. Because of the Enlightenment emphasis on reason, he believed that the age-old persecution of Jewish people would soon end. Of course, we know now that wasn't the case, and that much exploitation and oppression has taken place under the guise of reasoned thought. Pseudoscientific reason has been used to justify many forms of structural inequality, from racism to sexism to class systems. Rationality would not prove to be a way out of the human urge to create and marginalize outsiders. But Enlightenment thought was nonetheless transformative, and seeking worldly explanations for inequality and injustice did have significant real-world consequences. I mean, no longer would we see earthquakes merely as acts of God. Enlightenment challenges to the idea that we were already living in the best of all possible worlds would also help us to imagine and eventually to live in better worlds, albeit ones that are still profoundly imperfect. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching Crash Course, which is made by all.
I want you to think back to the chapter on the early Greek philosophers and their views of the world, right? So we have these early philosophers who believe in this idea of causality, right? That your experiences in life are based on God's, right? We have little, we really don't have much of a will. What happened, so we talk about that, and then we talk about the Islamic Empire. Why do we not talk about Greece or anyone else for many hundreds of years? What happened? What do we have the fall of? So we had the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Okay, everyone with me? All right. And what happened during the fall of the Roman Empire?
Like considered the Dark Ages, really like the materials of all philosophers, because they didn't like deem it correct of like the eyes of the Christian beliefs. They like kind of contradicted.
Right. So we have people rejecting these philosophical ideas in support of religion and finding these ideas to be very dangerous, because many of the ideas that were posited by these early philosophers were in contrast to religious views. Many cities burned down. Most books were destroyed. Some, however, still existed, right? And we find that in the Islamic Empire, there was a call to rewrite these texts so that they were available for everyone, right? So we talk about certain philosophers in the Islamic Empire writing about the works of Plato. Is this ringing a bell? Okay. So this is going on in Islam. We have the Dark Ages going on other places. This era of enlightenment was huge. The idea of light coming out of this dark place, and reason was held to be of great importance. So I want to talk about a couple of these points. The Age of Enlightenment challenged the old ways of doing things. So from that video, what are some changes that happened during the Enlightenment? That could be changes in the way people think, changes in what it meant to be a middle-class citizen. What sorts of changes were going on?
Men were taking off their wigs and makeup and being more natural.
Yeah, men were getting rid of those wigs. Love the wig, but being more natural, being able to express themselves a little more. Good start. Other things. There was a middle class who actually they were able to do things, right? So before this time, if you weren't an aristocrat, you were not afforded the opportunity for much higher education, correct? And so with the emergence of a middle class, we see more people being educated. This knowledge is being passed around. So more people are exposed to these great works and start thinking for themselves. All right. How about upper class women? What was it like to be an upper class woman during this time? Did you hear them talk about the salons and how those were springing up? And those were opportunities for women to get together and talk, and that had not been the case for a long time. Many of the great thinkers of the day would get together in salons and discuss items as diverse as mathematics, philosophy, physiology, and together that combination of these great minds led to lots of prolific developments in science during that time. Also during this time, there was a flourishing of the arts. If you look at art during the Enlightenment, beautiful, beautiful paintings. So that was a focus. There was a focus on beauty. There was a focus on knowledge. So in many ways, depending on who you were, it was a really interesting and great time to be alive. Something that was stated a lot was reason above religion. So this idea that if you are religious, you're not a reasonable person. And there's a dichotomy there, right? So what happens if you are religious, but you also believe in reason? So that was something that was addressed by different philosophers as well. It still was much better to be wealthy than not to be wealthy during this time. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, the Age of Enlightenment took place from the late 17th to the late 18th century. I want to review a little bit on David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher, and he's the first Scottish philosopher that we've talked about, correct? He stated, all we can ever know is that certain regularities occurred in the past, leading us to expect that they will occur in the future. We watched a video in class on Tuesday that had to do with what? If you need to look at your notes, that's fine.
What do you mean by what? Like,
what was the topic of the video on Tuesday?
it was about like David Hume and his like body theory, where it's like it's the contrast of, are you really the person who you were like born as, or do you like constantly change?
Mm-hmm. So we were talking about individualism, right? And to what extent are you the same person? Yeah, we're getting there. Kind of get the dust bunnies out of our heads today, right? So this concept of individualism, to what extent do you remain the same person you are? And to what extent do you change, right? And what did Hume believe?
You believe that self does not persist over time. There's no use since birth.
So that we do change a great deal, but that there are some core traits that carry through. He gave the example of if you haven't seen a friend in a long time, you want to catch up, you want to ask that friend what they've been up to, hobbies, etc., right? Because you recognize that they have had experiences since you saw them last, right? So this idea that we have experiences and these experiences change us, and based on our environment we're in and the type of experiences, those could change us a lot or change us a little. So let's think about people who go through traumatic experiences, like Hurricane Katrina. Were those people changed a lot? I would guess so. You were probably changed a whole lot if your house was destroyed, right? But even if your house was not destroyed, I would guess that you were changed just by the fact that this atrocious event had taken place. So changes like that can affect a cohort, a group of people, or there can be changes, whether they be traumatic or good, that affect someone on the individual level. All right, so that will be really important for our next exam to understand this concept of individualism and what Hume meant by that. All right, we're also going to talk about Kant today. Kant addressed this idea of causality, and this is a quote: "If one couldn't actually know causality in nature, the underpinnings of science and knowledge seem to be challenged." So I'd like you to join me and turn to the first page of our chapter 4 on page 135, and I'm going to read for a moment. In the late 1700s, a secluded German philosopher at the University of Königsberg arose from what he called his dogmatic slumbers. This makes me think of one of our earlier philosophers who liked to slumber. Trained in the tradition of German philosophy, he'd previously written respected but unspectacular works on topics such as the existence of God and the difference between absolute and relative space. But now, stimulated by a challenge from one of Locke's successors in the British Associationist School, he embarked on a program of critical philosophy that subtly but crucially refashioned the German view of humanity and nature. Among its other consequences was a climate of opinion conducive to the scientific study of the mind and the development of a new and experimental psychology. Something I want you to make note of is we're talking about Immanuel Kant as his ideas apply most directly to psychology. There's so much about him that has to do with his beliefs on religion that we are not covering, but that I encourage you to maybe look at if you have time. So, Immanuel Kant was awakened by the Scottish philosopher David Hume, and I mean awakened in the intellectual respect. All right, Kant developed a variation on the nativist theme. He stated that causality must represent an innate contribution of the mind. So again, this is something that's built into the mind. And he talks about two separate domains of reality. And those two domains are the noumenal and the phenomenal world. We talked a little bit about this, I believe, in class on Tuesday. The noumenal world are objects themselves as they exist in a pure state. So we could look at this desk, and we could look at its height, and we could feel how hard it is, and how much space it takes up, and what it's used for. The phenomenal world is the inside of our mind. So the ultimate reality of the noumenal world is completely unknowable, because what happens when we see these objects, our mind immediately does something to them. Our mind is seeking to understand the objects, right, and further classify them. Does that make sense? That concept, I think, can be challenging to grasp. So again, I just want to say this. We'll go back to the apple example. We have an apple and it's composed of different characteristics, and we talked about it having a stem, having seeds. You can cut it up with one of those apple cutter uppers, right? It could be green or it could be red. And those are characteristics that apple comes with. We know the apple through our own minds. So our mind immediately turns that apple into something that's known in the phenomenal or outside world, okay? So again, ultimate reality of the noumenal world is completely unknowable. That sounds depressing, right? What's knowable are many of the major characteristics that actively create the phenomenal world. Phenomenon had been Plato's original Greek term for appearance, and in many ways, Kant's phenomenal world resembled Plato's world of everyday experiences. Okay, Kant also believed that our mind is made to organize our experiences. If you want to follow along on page 137, I'm at the third paragraph. It says, to start, Kant argued that the mind automatically and immediately localizes experience in space and time. And these dimensions he refers to as the two intuitions. So the two intuitions are space and time. An experience happens somewhere and at some time. We further organize subjective experiences automatically in terms of categories. All right, let's take an example. I'm going to write a few things on the board. All right, what are some of the first words that babies say? I know you're a mom, so what are some of the first words?
Her first word was like mama and then dada right after.
Okay, so mama and dada. Okay, other early words.
No.
Huh?
No.
No, okay. Others, let's keep going. I'd like to hear from everyone.
My first word was ball.
Was ball? Okay. Others. Don't know what your first word was?
I think mine was mama, but my niece said please first.
Said please? Oh, I love it. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Any other words?
Give. I hear a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That.
And oftentimes give me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Give me something. Uh-huh. Anything else we can add to this list? Maybe if someone has a pet, they might say dog or cat.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So a child learns how to talk through the process of being talked to, correct? That's a big part of that, and that's called reciprocal socialization. So the caregiver interacts with the child. The child is hearing language frequently, and oftentimes that language is spoken in what we call motherese. That's an actual term in developmental psychology, and motherese is characterized by these high-pitched tones and well, you know it when you hear it, right? Like when people talk to a baby, they just usually change, right? Usually don't talk to a baby like I'm talking to you right now. Okay. Through the process of this reciprocal socialization, the child is learning about the world around them, right? They're learning what they can expect from their caregivers. They realize that there's someone that seems to be around them a lot, holding them a lot, feeding them a lot, which they really like. And these people are called mama and dada, right? And over time, the association grows. So we find that these are the people that, they help when we're crying. Change our diaper, right? Give us food. Tuck us into bed. And over time, the children come to understand that the people who do these things are caregivers or parents. Does that make sense? So they have more experiences and they're able to attach a larger meaning to that, organizing that. All right? Let's say ball. A child sees something round and they call it a ball. Then a child sees an apple and they call it a ball. Why would they call an apple a ball? Yeah, we're trying to categorize. Our mind is using this innate faculty, and we are thinking, okay, things that have this shape are balls, right? So in the store, and the child's calling a grapefruit a ball, and an apple a ball, and what else could they call a ball that's in produce? An orange. Yes.
Grapes.
Grapes is really much smaller ones, right? And the baby keeps being corrected. No, that's an apple, or this is an orange. Well, that's a lot for a baby to comprehend, right? So it takes time, it takes experience. And for the baby to learn that, okay, balls are round, these things called fruit are round, but there's different kinds of fruit. They're different kinds of balls. So again, you're starting to see the organizational process in young children. The same thing, I think, when we've talked about dogs, this idea of we see something that's brown and fluffy and drools sometimes, and we call that a dog. And then we see something brown and fluffy that maybe doesn't drool, but it's smaller, and we call that a dog, but it's really a cat. All right, so it takes time and experience to organize these thoughts, but we're forever doing that in our mind, and we do it, Kant says, instantaneously. Does that make sense? That's a concept that I think in terms of philosophy can be really difficult to unpack. So I hope that example helped a little bit. If I think of any others, I will share them with you. So what we're doing is we're defining the qualities of objects, we're defining the qualities of people, what have you. We're also looking at relationships to one another. Okay, I thought this was very interesting. After stating the importance of studying the mind's organizing properties, Kant noted that such a study would never achieve the status of a true science like physics. He argued that mental phenomena, in contrast to physical objects investigated by scientists, if you want to follow along, I'm on page 138, have no spatial dimension, are too transient to pin down for sustained observation, can't be experimentally manipulated, and can't be mathematically described or analyzed. All right, so he thought we were not going to be able to do any of those things. And as such, we needed to stay in the realm of philosophy. Okay. How many of you went outside this morning and not afternoon? Yes? Okay. How did it feel when you went outside?
It felt awful. Define awful sense-wise. It felt awful. It was
It was cold.
absurdly cold, right? We can do that. Very cold, okay.
Like numbing to my face.
Yeah, numbing. I like that. So very descriptive, numbing to your face. I don't know about you, but when it's that cold, tears will come to my eyes and then they'll just stick. And I was for sure that those were going to freeze into icicles. I could not get my car unfrozen enough.
Yes,
Oh my gosh, how many minutes did it take you?
20 minutes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was almost late to give my sports psychology test to you guys. No, I have this de-icer. Do you guys use de-icer? I put that on and nothing was happening. And then I put my heat all the way up to 84 and it seemed like nothing was happening. So I was driving from Owasso to school with this little tiny hole, right, that I scraped like crazy. It seemed like the layers were about a 1/4 inch thick, but I got there. Anyway, I digress. It was numbing. Yes, it was numbing to our faces. What did it look like outside? The sun was shining, right?
There's ice everywhere.
There was ice everywhere, so this is something that we're seeing. We're feeling, right? So the sense of feeling numb. There's ice everywhere, so visually we see that. Pretty day, right? Very, very sunny, almost like that piercing kind of sun that happens. Yeah. Any other things you remember about going outside this morning in terms of your senses? I think sometimes the air actually smells crisp.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Yeah, I can't exactly define what that means, but you know it when you know it. Just like when it rains in Oklahoma, you can sort of tell when it's going to start because it gets that damp, earthy smell. Yeah, so we'll call it a crisp smell. Those are sensory experiences. Now, a lot of times therapists and other people will do something called a grounding technique, which is used to help center people, maybe calm them down. You're in a new place and you want to give that nervous system, something calming to do. And grounding strategies are to think of
Or identify different items. So 5 items, we're going to do this. You can see, what am I missing? So things you can see, hear. Thank you. The idea behind the grounding exercises is that they situate you within because you're thinking about the outside world, but also they situate you and make you more comfortable with your surroundings. So what I want you to do right now on a piece of paper is jot down 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can feel, 2 that you can smell, and 1 that you can taste. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this.
All right, take about 20 more seconds and then we'll share. I'd like to share something that they jotted down for sight.
The carpet.
The carpet, okay.
Chairs.
Chairs.
TV.
The TV, okay.
My notebook.
What?
My notebook.
Your notebook, okay.
Water bottle.
Huh?
Water bottle.
The H2O bottle, okay. Anything else?
I saw the papers on my desk.
Papers on your desk, good. Just as an aside, did you notice things about the room that maybe you hadn't really seen? Or, you know, we go into a room and we can be in it a long time but not really see it. So you may have noticed items, I don't know if anyone turned around and saw those. Actually, there are 3 computers there that are not plugged in or are on air sign, or it's the law over here. Okay. Things that you could hear. That was a little harder, right? So this grounding exercise requires you to really slow down, right? And listen carefully. That's harder. What do you have? Typing, yes. Are you over here with like, like mitten hands? Okay, typing. Which maybe you weren't really hearing that. It was more like white noise earlier, but now that I'm asking you to discern the noises, all of a sudden it becomes really loud in the center of the class.
Sorry.
Okay, no, I'm a really loud typist too.
Other things.
I can hear my sleeve moving across the paper as I wrote.
Ah, okay, sleeve moving. Is that gonna drive you nuts now? I don't know. Okay, what else?
Pencils writing. Yeah, sound writing.
Okay, sound of writing.
I said like the air or the heat.
Yes, air. Do you hear kind of like a little buzzing noise?
Yeah.
Fuzzy noise, anything else?
Sometimes the tables would creak.
Yeah,
All right. All right, so sight, hearing, what are we on? Feeling. I think this is about on its last leg here. Feeling,
Feel a pen in my hands.
okay? Pen in your hand.
Keyboard.
Keyboard.
Book.
Book. Book touch. I like it. Other things.
I can feel my hair on my neck. I usually wear it up.
Yeah, I can feel the antenna poking into my head in the back. Okay, hair, we'll put antenna.
My clothes.
Yeah, I could feel that too, and when I was thinking about feeling, I could feel how I must have one foot that's a little bit bigger than the other because I was in my shoes and I noticed the difference in how my shoe felt from my left shoe felt, or my left foot felt. I guess my shoe doesn't in itself have feeling versus my right one. How did you feel? Could you feel your sitting bones in the chair or back or anything? Maybe. Comfy chairs? So-so? So-so, okay. I've been in harder ones for sure. All right, 2 things you can smell.
I can smell my perfume.
Your perfume, okay.
The smell of detergent on my hoodie.
I like that, and the smell of fabric softener. So sometimes it's a little strong, but other things.
I could smell my lotion on my hands.
Anything else? To me, it smells a little musty in here.
Yeah, I said classroom.
Okay. You can say that, yeah, a little musty. Anything else? All right, how about one thing that you can taste? I'm an obsessive toothbrusher, so I can taste Colgate in my mouth. Anything else?
Chewing gum.
Chewing gum, all right. Now, we're gonna build on this. I'm trying to kind of work us into what we're gonna be talking about. Let's take, are you afraid?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's take this perfume, all right? The sensation is the actual smell, all right? The perception is what you do, how your mind interprets that, all right? We smell a perfume. A lot of our memories are tied to our olfactory sense or sense of smell. This may be a perfume that someone you loved who's recently passed away wore, right? Or it could be a perfume you really like, the lilac scents. So we're not purely smelling. Our minds are busy perceiving and doing things with that information. We hear the sound that
Sounds like typing, but unless we see it, according to many of these philosophers, we don't know if it's typing or not, right? It could be the sound of something that just seems like typing. The buzzing noise sort of wants me to investigate. I hear a buzzing noise and I was trying to figure out, is that coming from the air? Is it coming from the lights? Is it coming from inside my mind, which I hope not. Bottom line is I want you to understand that what you sense and now how you perceive those things can vary. Optical illusions are really good examples of items that we see and our mind interprets in certain ways. How many of you are familiar with optical illusions? Okay, I would guess most people know of the one where there's like the two faces or the what? The vase, all right. Any others you can think of?
This one.
What is this one?
It's like psychology one. It's like the
Oh, the psychology one. It's a woman.
one face away, or I don't know what, the cave, I think. Something, I don't remember.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not great always at these. Optical illusions. I'm thinking of another one. In Psychology of Personality, on the front of the book, the way that the book is designed, looking at it one way, you can see a mouse. And looking at it another way, you can see an elephant, which I thought was interesting. I don't know what that has to do with personality, but it's there. Okay. One more item about perception. I want to go back to development and think about a baby who's learning how to walk, because we're actually going to be talking about that later in the chapter as it pertains to something called the visual cliff experiment. In order to go from crawling or walking, several things need to happen for the baby, right? Ideally, the baby's able to sense its body on the ground, right, physically moving. It has the musculature to do so. It can see well, it can hear, so the baby can maybe hear the father's voice and go toward that. Walking combines sensation and perception, right? And the motivation that you want to go somewhere. So when we think of something like that, it's definitely a sensory motor task that requires sense and perception to be married before the action can occur. All right, we're going to leave that for a while and talk about the law of specific
Nerve energies. On page 138, if you look at the bottom paragraph, it states neurophysiologists in the early 19th century discovered the so-called law of specific nerve energies, asserting that each sensory nerve in the body conveys only one kind of sensation. Up to this point, people thought like Descartes, that there were these tubes, right? And that things like animal spirits could go through them, and that these tubes were conveying sensory information. With the law of specific nerve energies, what was found is that these different quote-unquote tubes convey different information. So we have some that convey sight information, right? Others that convey auditory information, olfactory information. And this was a huge finding that took place. Each sensory nerve conveys one and only one kind of sensation. This was built on the work of Bell and Mueller and challenged the notion, as I already mentioned, of sensory nerve as something like a hollow tube capable of conveying any kind of stimulation introduced into it. So light and sound would be examples. Instead, they stated that each sensory nerve contains one and only one kind of sensation, regardless of how it's stimulated. Let's take our optic nerve, for example. I want you to go ahead and close your eyes, and I want you to press hard, not super hard, on your right side of your temple. Can you see a spot appear on your left? Maybe I'm not saying this the right way. Okay, open your eyes. I think I need book help, textbook help.
I think it's almost like close your eye and then put pressure on the outside of your eyeball.
Okay, do that. Close your eye, put pressure on your outside of your eyeball. Now do you see
Something on the opposite side? Well, you should, okay? But you're not feeling that eyeball hurts, right? You're just seeing something, and that's because that nerve does one thing and one thing only. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, immediate sense of sensory experience is not the external world alone, but the sensory nervous system that's interacting with the external world. So our senses interact with the external world, and then that perception is that interpretive component. Physical scientists demonstrated the idea that various forces, waves, and energies in the physical world are not directly, but rather indirectly perceived by the senses. And although we can't directly measure something, the scientists were able to indirectly measure things, and that's where frogs come into play. Okay, so the person who is known for experiments on frogs is Helmholtz. He was born in 1821 and lived till 1894 in the Prussian town of Potsdam near Berlin. And in terms of Helmholtz, if you want to follow along, I believe we're on page 140. His father was a high school teacher and was really absorbed by the work of Immanuel Kant. Helmholtz was obsessed with science and specifically physics. He read all kinds of books on physics, and it was stated that it was a consuming passion of his. To illustrate, it says he worked on optics diagrams beneath his school desk when he should have been studying Latin, spoiled the family linen with chemistry experiments, I'm not sure how to interpret that, and in due course became the most promising young scientist in town. During this time, however, it was not, unless you were wealthy, it was not a discipline that you would study, okay, the discipline of science. You would do something that would be more practical. Luckily, Helmholtz was noticed for his prodigious talents and great interest in science, and he was awarded free medical training. He was able to attend medical school, and in return, he was asked to serve in the military as a surgeon after graduation for, I believe, 8 years. Let's see if this opens up for us. Should we trust this source? Maybe not. Let's hold that for a moment. So we're going to listen to this, hopefully.
Hermann von Helmholtz, a German physician and physicist, made several important discoveries throughout his career. One of his most significant contributions was his treatise on the conservation of energy in the human body. This work revolutionized our understanding of the physiological processes that take place within the human body and laid the groundwork for further research in the field of physiology. Helmholtz's findings have had a profound and lasting impact on the scientific community.
Move on. All right, so Helmholtz is really into physics and science generally. Well, he has a lot of time on his hands because evidently people don't need surgery all the time, okay? And as an army surgeon, he found his official duties pretty tedious. That wasn't really what he wanted to do necessarily with his life. Luckily, they offered him some free time. So what he did is he set up a lab in the barracks to study the metabolic processes of frogs, of all things. All right, so you can imagine this person who's in the army and has this little frog lab, right? Sort of a different way to go in the military. And if you want to look on page 142, his experiments demonstrated that the amount of energy and heat generated by frog muscles was roughly equal to the amount of energy released by the oxidation of food it consumed. So, in other words, he showed that ordinary chemical reactions were capable of producing all of the physical activity and heat generated by a living organism. And this was a really important finding that led to the law of conservation of energy. At the time, it was a hypothetical notion that all kinds of forces in the universe, this would be heat, light, gravity, magnetism, etc., are potentially interchangeable forms of a single, huge, but quantitatively fixed reservoir of energy. This was quite a finding and was recognized as such by the government. The government said, you know, you've been doing so much in your frog lab that maybe we're going to have you work for us full time. And so his military, his time in the military was shortened. Guys, if I can have your attention, please. Thank you. And he was named a professor of physiology at Kant's Old University. He conducted another study of frogs that's really important for you to know for the exam, which is the speed of nerve signals. So what he found is that if you stimulate, you have a frog and you stimulate a part of the body, let's say the frog's, next to the frog's eyeball. The frog is going to feel that stimulation sooner than it would feel stimulation on its little frog leg. Okay, so he found that impulses travel at different rates. And so if we were to, which hopefully wouldn't happen, get smacked, I don't think there's snow for snowballs, but if we were smacked in the face with a snowball, we would feel that sooner than we would if we slipped on ice. Okay, does that make sense? I guess unless we fell head first, which I hope would not happen. Okay. What I want you to do, we have about 7 minutes left in class. I want you to get into 2 groups. So let's do a group of 3 here and a group of 3 here. And I want you to look at Fechner. This is the next person we're going to be talking about. So group 1, which is the group on the right-hand portion of the room, is going to look at page 154 and 155 through the second paragraph. And then the second group, which is on the other side of class, is going to look at 155 through 156. And what I want you to do is go through that, and you're going to present some of the important points to the class. Okay, so take a few minutes to do that. Hopefully we'll have time to get through that during this class time. Is everyone clear on what you're doing? Okay.
So I think that you guys have his early life, right? Is that really? Okay. So for this group, I want you to talk about make sure you mention his two-facedness so he was upset by the two-facedness of nature. That's a lot to say, it's a mouthful. And talk about, he talks about the night view and the day view, so you'll need to make mention of that. And then talk about his breakdown and recovery, which is, I think, mentioned on the next page. It has to do with an eye injury. What you may want to do, we have about 3.5 minutes left, is go ahead and I'd like to see this on a couple of slides. is go ahead and come up with some slides, and you'll be presenting this at the start of class on Tuesday, okay? Should take probably about 3 or 4 minutes to present. So if everyone comes up with a slide, I would be fine with that, okay?
Let's just email it.
Yeah, you can email it to me. But I would like to look at what you have in just a couple of minutes.
They're protecting Madison.
And if it works for everyone, you can present on your own slide. So you would just have like your first name and then your slide. And this is going to count as a in-class grade. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. Make sure you have this ready to go on Tuesday. If you have any questions for me, let me know. The exam will close, as I said, Sunday. Make sure you read the instructions
before you start the exam, and I will be grading those manually. There's quite a few fill in the blank, and I know that when I grade them, I input the answer a lot of times. Spelling makes a difference, so I want to make sure if you're not spelling something correctly, but I still know what it is, that you get credit for that. So with that, I wish everyone a good rest of their week. Thank you.